Shavua Tov. I want to talk about a few different puzzles that are sort of related or interlocking that you can find in Parshat Vayera, and the stories about Avraham and Sarah and Lot and Sdom. And to some degree, maybe they're separate points, and also they may not be full resolutions, but I think there are a few observations you can make that maybe help one to see some of these events that are very familiar from these narratives in a different way. So first of all, maybe this is a more obvious point, but I think that there is an interesting aspect of human sacrifice in the story of Lot. And what I mean by that is that Lot offers his daughters to the mob when the mob surrounds the house, right? He has these visitors that have come to his house, and he thinks it's terrible that the mob is demanding, they surround the house and say, when now town, we want to know who they are, or we want to deal terribly somehow with them. And Lot says, Oyomar alna ahai tera'u. So I beg you, my brothers, do not do so wickedly. And then he goes on, Hine nali shte vanot asher lo yar'u ish הוציאה נא אתכן עליכן, ועשו להן כטוב בעיניכם, רק לאנשים האל אל תעשו דבר, כי על כן באו בצל קראתי. Behold now, I have two daughters who have not known a man. Let me bring them out to you, and do to them as good as in your eyes, and only to these men do nothing, seeing as they have come under the shadow of my roof. So this maneuver of Lot's, where he's offering his daughters to the mob, is pretty easy to recognize as an ugly one, or one we can fault him for. And with that being said, I think it's still interesting to ask, what exactly is he thinking? Like, on what basis is he making this offer? How could it possibly be right in his eyes to fix the problem by offering his daughters? And there are at least two different things you could say. That either Lot understands himself to be visited by angels of God, but he has the wrong relationship with God. We can explain what we mean by that in a second. Or he just is, very, very strict about his observances regarding customary honor and safe haven given to visitors, and that is such a law, for him, that it goes above everything else. So he would sacrifice his daughters to that law, which makes it a kind of perverse idolatry, obviously. First of all, just to make the point simply about sacrificing his daughters, I think there are more and less obvious ways of putting that together. I don't know if this is an obvious way, but there's a commentary essentially in Sefer Shotim on this, in the book of Judges, because Yiftach is the shofet who famously says that if he's given victory over Bnei Ammon, the Ammonites, then he will sacrifice to Hashem whatever walks through his door. And then it turns out to be his daughter, and then he's stuck in a bind with this question of, is he going to sacrifice his daughter? And it seems like maybe he does. So door is one word, delet, that appears there. Petach is another word that appears, opening, because Yiftach is his name. He's fighting Bnei Ammon, which is, Ben Ami, which is the progenitor of the Ammonites, is the son of Lot by his daughters. And we're talking about sacrificing a daughter. So there are a lot of different elements there that line up, since here with Lot, it's, there's a door, there's an opening. Both of those words appear here when the mob is surrounding the house, and there's this question of whether the daughters are going to be offered up. And obviously, ultimately, the story ends essentially with the birth of the Ammonites. So there's already a textual commentary that you can find in the story of Yiftach that's saying, look, this is about human sacrifice at some level. Like, what Lot is doing is he's offering his daughters as a sacrifice. And that's not so hard to put together, because offering them to the mob so that they could perhaps be killed or have terrible things done to them is clearly at some level turning human beings into means that you're offering in exchange for something. And then the question is he sacrificing them to some god of hospitality that he's serving, that is, he's made an idol out of? Or is he sacrificing his daughters in his mind to Hashem? Like, does he already identify his visitors as angels sent by Hashem? And even if it's the latter, right, that's still a problem. It's not really more acceptable. Like, those Baruch Hu doesn't want human sacrifices ever. And even, to the degree that these malachim, as they are identified in the story, which you maybe would translate as angels, or maybe as messengers, but let's say it's angels. Even if we identify them as angels, it's interesting. There are two of them, right? There are two daughters, and there's two angels, and it is notable. I mean, narratively, we need to have two daughters for what happens later, because there are going to be these different sons that come from this incestuous union between Lot and his daughters. But the two angels is somewhat interesting, because in the binding of Isaac, which happens not long afterwards in Parashat Vayera, this very adjacent part of the Torah, there we have Avram being asked to sacrifice Yitzchak and being willing to, in a sense, but then it's two different angels, or maybe one angel speaking to him twice, but the word shenit appears, and an angel called to him a second time, or another angel called to him, saying to him, don't sacrifice your son, is where that lands. So there's a bit of this element of, when you have Avram with angels, they're telling him not to sacrifice his son, though he was willing. But the way he showed that willingness was that it started with a divine command to sacrifice his son, seemingly. And then the narrative works out how to sort of unravel that problem. Here, Lot is creatively coming up with sacrificing his daughters as a solution to a problem that maybe involves angels, but that's a very different footing to be on, right? That's not the same thing. It's one thing to show some kind of philosophical willingness to heed the divine command when you are not sure what you're hearing, but maybe what you're hearing is Hashem is commanding you to sacrifice your child, right? It's a different thing to say, all right, I'm so eager to show my loyalty to these messengers from Hashem that without being asked, I will offer my daughters as a human sacrifice to, show that I set these messengers from Hashem above everything, right? HaKadosh Baruch Hu obviously frowns very deeply on that kind of behavior. And so Lot's example is kind of showing this subtle difference between him and Avraham, that they both are these people who are capable of this devotion to Hashem, but Lot turns it into a perversity where he is leaning in and kind of running out ahead of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and creatively offering his children as sacrifice when it's not even being asked of him. And so he kind of doesn't get credit even for having the right attitude in the way that Avram does. But at the same time, in the case of Avram, HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't want Yitzchak as a sacrifice, and we eventually see that. So I think that's one kind of point. And the reason it maybe glancingly connects to the other thing I want to talk about, well, I don't know, it's more than glancingly, but the reason it connects to the other thing I want to talk about is because I'm also interested in Avram and Sarah and their visit with what we think of as being angels, usually in the way we tell the story, because it seems to be the same group of people. They're identified, these two angels that go down to Sodom seem to be the people from this party that visits Avram and Sarah beforehand. And they're not called angels in that story. Initially, they're just called men. But then it seems like if they're the same people, then they're eventually identified as malachim, which maybe is angels, when we're talking about the story with Lot. And so then we work backwards and we say, okay, so Avram and Sarah were also hosting messengers from Hashem. And that's especially easy because in that story, there's this whole thing where the people are sitting there, and one of them says to Sarah, "Oh, another year when I come back at this later time, this year or this time of year later, you'll have a son." And then HaKadosh Baruch Hu repeats more or less the same thing. And so we say, oh, so this guy is a messenger from Hashem. So we'll get more into, the detail of that in a second. But to really trace the thread more explicitly, I think the first point to ask is, what do we know about what happens with Lot's wife? And why is that related? Because with Lot's wife, what she's famous for is turning into a pillar of salt. That's all she does in the text of the Torah itself. We don't really care much about her until she's told not to look behind her. She does. And then she turns into a Nitziv Melach, a pillar of salt. So let's just pull that up. So she is told not to look behind her. And then it says, what tabet ishto me'aharau watehi nitziv melach. But his wife looked back from behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. And then Chazal do something interesting with the Midrash that everyone feels they know so well that they just read it into the story, which is, oh, well, actually, Lot's wife turned into a pillar of salt. Why? Because she pretended that she didn't have any salt when they were receiving the guests and that she needed to go and borrow salt from the neighbors in order to actually kind of inform the people of Stone that there were these visitors, and that's why the mob knew to surround the house. And so she was sort of, snitching to the secret police, so to speak. But because she used salt to do that, then she turns into a Nitziv Melech, into a pillar of salt. And, when you get kids learning that in school, and then you try to talk to them about this, it's so easy to just read it in as backstory that explains what happened, and it closes the issue. It's like, oh, well, that's a rather odd occurrence. She turned into a pillar of salt, but it's explained by the fact that she snitched. And now that we know that, she got what was coming to her, and we can, write that off. But really, what Chazal are doing is something that should serve the opposite purpose, right? When Chazal introduce a midrash like this, they're not doing it to give you some extra facts you didn't know. It's just so you can fill in arbitrary additional occurrences into the whole narrative. They're trying to hint to you of what this is related to, what this is connected to, this should get you to be thinking about. And so I think there are, and they're doing it on the basis of things they're seeing in the text of Chumash that actually make that connection more subtly. So first of all, I think that what you have to ask is, what is it about what Lot's wife is doing that could be a problem on its own, on its own merits, meaning not because there's some backstory that we fill in. Like, why, if she turns into a Netziv Melech, what is that? Well, first of all, we know the geography of the place they're leaving is Yam HaMelech, right? This is going to become the Salt Sea, this area, Kikar Yarden, as the Torah describes it. So the post Sodom and Gomorrah geography is that this is a salty place. There are salt crystals. And so really what we're talking about is her becoming part of the geography of the place, and like a particularly preserved and dead part of it, right? That what salt is for, and the idea of the Torah is making something last forever, but also it kills it. And so when she's looking back, clearly this is about, in a sense, a reluctance to leave this place, a reluctance to let go of this place, a desire to remain a part of it. And, there are other details. Maybe she actually looked back and that led her in some way to be killed, and then she got covered up with salt at some point, right? Like, I mean, you can fill in more quotidian kind of details or mundane details if you want for that part. And then the focus of the text, though, is on she looked back, so she turned into a pillar of salt. It's really about an unwillingness to let go of stone that becomes such a problem, right? That there was a great error in that, because it wasn't just, I looked over my shoulder. It's really, even though stone was such a wicked place, I want to take that with me and bring it to where I'm going next. I want to sort of stay connected to stone. And so then she gets portrayed in the Midrash as, a bad person, which in some sense, maybe this is a sign that she was. So the other thing, though, is there are elements of narrative that we end up connecting, that we can string together from what happens in Stone back to another wife who doesn't look back, but who maybe has something of a similar kind of role in an opposite story. And that is Sarah, right? So when we compare the moment when the three visitors come to Abraham and Sarah, in that case, it's Abraham and Sarah swinging into action in order to feed these people and take care of them and everything. And it's not just Abraham. And then we go over to Lot, and it's all about Lot inviting them in and Lot giving them matzot and throwing a sort of banquet for them. And Lot's wife is conspicuously absent, right? So part of what Chazal are noticing is that Lot's wife is not a participant in this hospitality that he's trying to give. And that's showing perhaps her sodomite loyalty or something, right? That she's loyal to this system in which people don't show this kind of hospitality. That's another strike against her, but it also, brings out other comparisons between the texts. Like she turns into a Nitziv Melah, right? A pillar of salt. But actually, when we go to, when first you have Avram sitting at the, entrance of his tent, it's ויסע עיניו, וירא והנה שלושה אנשים ניצבים עליו, וירץ לקראתם מפתח האוהל, וישתחוו ארצה. And he lifted his eyes and looked, and lo, three men stood by him. And when he saw them, he ran to meet them from the tent door and bowed himself to the ground. So he sees them, and they are nitzavim. They're standing there. So the word nitziv, like a pillar of salt, they are nitzavim. They're standing there. And they're called anashim here, but later, when two of them go down to stone, then they're called malachim. And it's malach with a chaf, as opposed to melah with a het. But those two sounds can be plays on each other in terms of plays on words, and they're not dissimilar enough that you can't put that together. And there are indeed other places in the Torah where that substitution gets made as a way of making plays on words. Like, for example, perhaps in the case where we're remembering Amalek and we're talking about the stumblers, and they're called in Shalim with a het in Sefer Dvarim, in the book of Deuteronomy, but really it should be Shalim with a chaf, one would think. But the Torah puts a het there. So you have these instances where it seems like the text understands that there are these substitutions that can be made. And here, if we understand that, then it's like Nitzavim and they're Malachim, so it's like Nitziv Melach. And also there are other things that are even more explicit, like there's all this stuff about the opening of the tent and who's standing at the opening of the tent and listening at the opening of the tent. For example, when Sarah hears that someone is saying that she's going to have a son, right? It says, with Sarah shoma'at petach ha'ohel wehu aharau, right? And Sarah heard it from the tent door, which was behind him. But it's interesting, right? So the word petach appears in the story with Lot because the people are trying to find the opening. The mob is there. They're trying to break in. But also this word aharau. Aharau is behind him, so she's listening behind him. But also, we said when Lot's wife was looking behind her, it really doesn't say behind her. It says that she was looking behind him. Right? It says, "Wa tabet ishto me'aharau v'tehi nitziv melach." So she was looking behind him somehow, and so the word aharau also appears there. So you have various connections like that I think really, aside from the fact that it's hosting malachim or who are coming to your house, where Chazal are really comparing these two pieces that are not so dissimilar and even narratively are all chained together and saying, look, Sarah and the wife of Lot are not the same. And the ways in which they differ show the difference between Sodom and what Sarah and Abraham will become as nations. And they also show the difference between Abraham and Lot and the hospitality of Abraham and his household and the hospitality of Lot and his household. And even, we can connect that back again to this theme of child sacrifice, that Lot and Avram also differ in the way that they get close to child sacrifice. And Avram is better than Lot in that regard as well. So with all of that being said, I think now there are a few, maybe two other kinds of comments that again may not have to be totally related, but I think are maybe also interesting about the story with Sarah and Abraham. One of these is maybe more directly connected with Lod and Stone. So let's address that first. There's another connection between the life of Abraham and Sarah and the wife of Lot, and the life of Lot that maybe helps explain something in the story with Abraham and Sarah that is always a bit troubling and strange. And that is how it is that Hagar and Ishmael are expelled and sent away from the household of Abraham. And there are different ways you can try to explain that set of events, and some of them are interesting, to develop through other means of support. So I don't want to disagree with those per se, but here's another way of looking at it that I think is a bit interesting, and that is to say, the 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 moment when we lose Yishmael is where he is mitzahek, right? He is mocking. And because he is mocking, that somehow is what seems to inflame Sarah against him. And in Midrashim, we have to, make a big deal out of this. Like he was threatening to kill Yitzhak, or he was doing Avodah Zarah, right? Like we can explain it that way, with the help of Chazal, and then it's like, oh, well, of course you have to get rid of that guy. It says, "Vaterer Sarah et ben Hagar hamitzrith asher yelda leAvraham mitzahek." So Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had born to Abraham, mocking. ותאמר לאברהם גרש האמה הזאת ואת בנה, כי לא יירש בן האמה הזאת עם בני עם יצחק. So she said to Abraham, cast out this slave and her son, for the son of the slave shall not be heir with my son, with Yitzchak. It seems really mean, and it seems bafflingly out of character for Abraham and Sarah, who are supposed to be all about chesed and kindness and everything, that I mean, at this point, Hagar is not just a slave. She is now the mother of one of Avram's children and must have some standing in the household as a result of that. There's even kind of reference to that earlier, but she's bearing Ishmael. And to just suddenly cut ties over a behavior issue with Ishmael, this is why Midrashim have to make a big deal out of this. But I think without needing to go into those Midrashim, there are other things we can think about in the text that are maybe ultimately going to be the explanation for those Midrashim to some degree. But I think the thing I want to focus on here is this word mitzachek. So mocking, mitzachek, it can mean different things. Maybe over with the golden calf, it means idolatry. Maybe it also can mean something to do with sexuality or sexual impropriety. We have it in other places where it seems more likely to be associated with that, as when Rivka and Yitzchak are in Gerar with Avimelech. But the basic set of examples that we have from Yitzchak, we have this one. Also, by the way, it's maybe used that way with Yosef and Eshet Potiphar. But in these examples, the first two examples we have from Mitzachek is here and then over with Lot, right? Because then when Lot wants to leave because the Malachim are telling him they have to get out of there before the city is destroyed, it says, Vayetze Lot, Vayedaber el Hothnav, Lochei b'notav, Vayomer kumu tzu min hamakom hazeh, ki mashchit Adonai et ha'ir, Vahi kemitzachek ba'inei Hothnav. And Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-law who had married his daughters and said, arise, get out from this place, for the Lord will destroy this city. But to his sons-in-law, it seemed that he was joking. So the question is, what does mitzachek mean exactly? And I think that in between, we get more indication of that because obviously Yitzchak is named with the same root. It's about laughter, right? Tzchok is laughter. And Sarah talks about how everyone will laugh for her because she has this son. And she laughed when she first heard someone suggest that she would have a son. And so if laughter is about that, then it is at its core in these examples about sort of disbelief at something that seems impossible, like sort of chuckling at the impossibility of something, right? وَتِضْحَكْ سَرَّى بِكِرْبَهْ لَمُرْ أَحْرِي بِلْوَثِي هَيْثَالِي عِدْنَا وَأَدُونِي زَكَيْنِ. Therefore Sarah laughed within herself, saying, after I am grown old, shall I have the pleasure, and my old Lord also being old, like, and my Lord also being old, being talking about Abraham. So she's saying, shall I have the pleasure of having a child when I'm old already? It's kind of funny, it's impossible. So if that's what mitzahek is connected to, if we read that as the meaning of mitzahek, then mitzahek is about saying things that sound ridiculous because you don't believe that something that's being claimed is possible. Um, and in the case of Lot, he was deemed a mitzahek because he was saying, this city is going to be destroyed. We have to get out of here, right? So in that instance, I think the thing I want to pick up on is that Lot was trying to uproot his family and get them to leave and saying, look, we can't stay here anymore. That's over. Like, this place is done. We have to find somewhere else to go. And the interesting thing is that we could consider the possibility that that is also the discussion over with Ishmael and Hagar, right? Because Hagar, as that pasuk reminds us, is Mitzrit, right? She's from Egypt. And so at the moment where he's Mitzachek, her son is Mitzachek, in whatever that means, the text reminds us that she is an Egyptian. Ultimately, they leave and go in the direction of Egypt. Maybe they kind of don't make it there, but in principle, at least, that's where they're headed. They go down in the desert by Beersheba. And to the degree that that's the case, maybe you could say that they were on their way to Mitzrayim. That's what they were trying to do. They were trying to go back to Egypt. Now imagine the possibility that this discussion began with Ishmael saying, we need to get out of this place, all of us, and go to Egypt, right? That's where his mother's from. Canaan has uncertain water from year to year. Sometimes there are famines. That was the reason that Avram and Sarai went down to Mitzrayim in the first place, which is maybe where they got Hagar. And to the degree that that's the case, one can always try to make the argument, look, this isn't a good place for us to stay. We should go to Egypt because we'll eat better, we'll have a more stable life, whatever. And that would, by the way, also explain the Midrashim that tried to suggest that, the Mitzachek action of Ishmael was really about his tendency to Avodah Zarah. If you want to go back to Egypt, then you really want to go back to the idolatry of Egypt. And so that is about Avodah Zarah. So if we consider that, the reason that that could make sense to some degree is because, again, it's part of this same cassette where we're paralleling, on the one hand, Sarah, and on the other hand, Lot's wife, right? Lot's wife wanted to stay in Sodom, like she was resisting leaving. And in the case of Abraham, he has kind of two wives, sort of, and so one leaves and one stays. And so that is how we get, as an average of those two things, kind of a wife who leaves, but it's sort of looking back. So in the instance of Sarah and Hagar, imagine Yishmael is saying, look, let's go to Mitzrayim. Staying here doesn't make sense. And whether you want to say that Yishmael is trying to persuade them that Canaan is going to be destroyed and they don't believe him and that's why he's Mitzachek, or that he is Mitzachek by referring somehow to the impossibility of living in Canaan. He, as the person trying to leave, paralleling Lot, is viewed as the Mitzachek, right? And in these different instances, it's different who's sort of on the side of Hashem in that, right? That in Lot's case, he's saying, look, Hashem's going to destroy this place, and he's right. In the case of Ishmael, he's saying, look, Canaan is going to be destroyed by famine or whatever. So, he would, in that case, be right or be wrong. But he would be plausibly, making the case on the basis of comparing Mitzrayim to Canaan. Egypt is better watered, and so there is an argument for doing that. But Sarah has a child, right? And when she's saying now, this woman who wants to be a slave, right? And maybe she's saying that because she's saying like she wants to go back to Mitzrayim. Okay, she wants to go to Egypt, so she can be a slave in Egypt. She will not inherit with my son. What she's saying is, look, this is their choice. If they want to go back to Mitzrayim, then they can go back to Mitzrayim, but we're not going. So that's a very different discussion than what we are usually used to and thinking about in the text. And we have to still work within the bounds of what the text gives us, right? The word is garesh, like expel, send these people out. So at one level, the text is emphasizing this still is Sarah severing the connection in the family. But it's such a different dynamic, isn't it? If what that really is about is that Ishmael and Hagar maybe are the ones who are coming in with a kind of almost coercive and forceful demand that they're making for the family. And they're saying, look, we shouldn't all live here. We should get out of here because life will be better in Mitzrayim. And if that's the case, then Sarah is saying, look, in that case, we have to sever ties legally, right? Like we were one family, but if you leave, then you can't at the same time still claim to be part of this family and an inheritor of Abraham and everything. You're choosing to go off. And remember that Ishmael, he was 13 when he circumcised before the birth of Yitzchak. So this is already years later because Yitzchak has been weaned now, or at least if we follow that part of the text in sequence. So Ishmael is not a child. Ishmael is young, or at least he could be young, but he's not a child. He's at an age where maybe he really would be the one pushing for this and making the argument. He's almost an adult, certainly in that generation. So I think you at the end of the day, you have room to read things in the text different ways, but it is worth considering how much this changes about how we understand Sarah and Abraham and what happened in this moment, if it's the case that this was really about, should we stay in Canaan or should we go down to Mitzrayim and start making our life there? Because I think what's so interesting in that case is that Sarah has a young child in Yitzchak. And it's very plausible, actually, this argument of life will be better in Mitzrayim. And when you have a young child, maybe you want to go to, Mitzrayim. Maybe there is a bit of a famine going on right now in the story. And Sarah could say, well, I finally got my miracle child from Hashem. And now that I have him, I want to do what's best for him, through my own judgment of the kind of life that he should have. But instead, in that moment, she's saying, no, Hashem gave me this child, and he also sent us to Canaan because of what we're trying to do here in Canaan. And we're not going to take over Mitzrayim with our descendants, but we can take over Canaan with our descendants. And it has to be here, and so we can't leave. And if Hashem can give us this miracle child, then Hashem can make us successful here. So we have to stay, right? And if that's the case, then there's something much more impressive and even kind of heroic about the stand that Sarah is making, where yes, legally she is effectively demanding that Hagar and Ishmael have to be severed from the family. But if that's because they're insisting on leaving, and it's because she's insisting on staying, then it's much more understandable and it's much less cruel, right? It doesn't look any longer like Avraham is listening to his more favored wife in an argument about inheritance where she wants all the money for her son and she wants with cruelty to expel this other woman and her child into the desert to die, right? All these, the text obviously wants us to read it that way when we're not looking closely, because it's not trying to sweep that under the rug. On the contrary, very often Tanakh will call your attention to the ugliness of what someone is doing so that you're really asking, like, how could they do this? If this is a tzaddik, like, why is he acting this way? But and one shouldn't diminish that aspect of it, right? At the end of the day, Hagar and Ishmael are being pushed out of the family, and there is something very unpleasant about that. And we should have you asking the question of, whether they're sort of being wronged in some way. But what's also the case is that we do need to understand this in light of who Avram and Sarah are, and it seems there's a way of understanding it where it's not about their greed or their cruelty, and it's also more understandable why Hashem would say to Avram, "Listen to Sarah," right? Sarah is saying, "Stay in Canaan." Sarah is saying, "Don't give up on the project that I have given you." That has been the point of all of this, and Avram at that point is going to listen to Hashem and he's going to listen to Sarah. And it makes sense. It makes sense even though he's such a Baal Chesed, he's such a kind man, and even though he had hopes for Ishmael and Hagar, right? If Hagar, and even really if Ishmael himself is saying, look, I'm not sticking around, I'm not going to make my life here, then that is a different kind of crisis in the family than the one that we maybe, think we're dealing with when we don't look closely. And I think you do get that from this word mitzachek and how it's used over with Lot and then also here. And given all the other parallels between these two stories that we already discussed, where we're supposed to compare them in other ways, I think it's interesting that that lines up as well and provokes us to look at this in a different way.